Hello and welcome to Lesson 8. So, at this point in your research and writing process, hopefully you've figured out what text you want to write on and also what topic you're hoping to cover, hoping to study by analyzing that text, and maybe you've thought about the lens too. So you have some idea of what you're planning to write about, and you've begun the research process, you've begun finding sources. What we covered in the last lesson was exactly that, finding sources. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about how to determine if a source is credible and reliable, whether or not you should use that source in your paper. As I've mentioned before, you're not necessarily required to use what we call scholarly sources for this paper. You can use almost any source you want as long as you analyze it and determine that it's a credible, reliable source. This is an important distinction. Most professors, when they have their students do research, require that they find scholarly sources, which means the source is published by a university press and also peer-reviewed, which means before the university press publishes it, they have several experts in the field read it to determine whether they should publish it or not. So it's fairly easy to identify scholarly sources for those reasons, and scholarly sources are almost always fairly objective and reliable. So while it's important to understand what a scholarly source is and to use them in your writing, once you learn what a scholarly source is, it's not very hard to identify a scholarly source. And while scholarly sources are important in college and important in probably a lot of careers, depending on what career you choose, they're not that important in day-to-day life. They're not unimportant, but in our culture in the 21st century, in our media-driven culture where we have smartphones and other devices that allow us to see media basically all day, we're constantly, if you're like me, you're constantly reading articles and watching videos. We're confronted with a plethora of information that is not scholarly information. But plenty of it is reliable and credible information that we should take in and analyze and interpret and synthesize. But unfortunately, we live in a period where, as you've learned through our first unit, where the internet and technology have given us great opportunities. Some of those opportunities are to publish more frequently with less restrictions, but that opportunity also creates a problem where now anyone can publish almost anything. And so unfortunately, the other side of this is that we live in an era of fake facts and fake news. And while there's plenty of good information out there that you should be digesting, there's also completely fabricated false information out there. And so when I designed the curriculum for this class, I asked myself, do I want my students to be able to identify a scholarly source? Yes, I do. Then I asked myself, is that all I want them to be able to do when it comes to research and finding and evaluating sources? And I said, no, it's not. I also want them to be able to discern what is factual, reliable information versus information that's fake or that's been fabricated. I think that's an important skill. It's an essential skill in the 21st century, but not necessarily one that's being taught all the time. So the result of this realization I've had that I just described is that instead of asking you to find 3 scholarly sources for your paper, I'm asking you to find 3 credible sources. So what constitutes a credible source? That's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. For your assignment this week, in addition to the discussion board post, I have another assignment I'm going to ask you to do where you fill out a worksheet, a credibility evaluation worksheet to determine if a source is credible. It's not too long of a worksheet. It won't take you too much time, probably just a few hours, but a few hours to fill out 3 of them, 1 for each source. You're required to have 3 sources in your final paper. They can be the same sources you use for these worksheets, but they don't have to be. You may very well discover through the process of doing these worksheets that a source isn't a very good choice and then end up picking a different one. So that's up to you. If you want to use the same sources you use for this assignment I'm going to talk about in this lecture for the paper or not. But the idea is no matter what sources you use in the paper, those sources pass this credibility test we're going to talk about today. They don't have to be scholarly, they can be, but no matter what they are, whether they're scholarly or popular or something else, you need to make sure that you actually analyze and evaluate them and see that they pass this CRAP test. It's a credibility test. And so today we're going to talk about what that credibility test is and go through some examples. I'll take you through the worksheet and we'll apply it to each of the 3 examples, the 3 articles on Black Panther that we looked at in the last lecture. And so hopefully that'll show you what I'm expecting both on the worksheet and anytime you look at a source and consider using it for this paper. To help you remember how to determine if a source is credible, some librarians I know have come up with an acronym called the CRAP test. So it's a funny name, and the funny part is the source has to be crap in order to pass the test. It should be credible, reliable, authoritative, accurate, and have an objective purpose. So credibility, reliability, authority, accuracy, and purpose are the 5 elements you want to look at when you're considering if a test passes the CRAP test. And the funny part to help get you to remember it is the source should be CRAP. It should meet these 5 requirements or criteria in order to be a credible source that you use in your papers. So what do these things mean? Credibility. What are the credentials of the author and the publication? Do their credentials make them trustworthy? Reliability, very similar. Do you feel like you can rely on this author and this publication to provide, credible information, that they're not making things up? Authoritative. So are they an authority on this subject? Have they done other research on it? Do they have other publications on it? What gives them grounds to be an authority? I could tell you I'm a pizza expert, and I can just say that, and you'd have no way of knowing it. I guess if you ate some pizza I made, you'd be able to determine, if it's good or not. You'd be able to determine if I'm an authority on making pizza or not. I may have gone to cooking school, I may have learned how to make pizza, or I may just be making that up. So you have to, put on an analytical cap here and look up some information about the author and publication, but not just look up that information. Read that information, analyze. Do I think I can trust this information? Why or why not? And that's really what this exercise is. I'm not trying to make things complicated with all these words. I'm more so trying to get you to just, when you read something, stop and think, can I trust this? Why do I trust this or not? Before reading it. And in this case, before citing it in an essay. Accuracy, again, where does the information come from? What can you see about their evidence, their information they present in their writing to say, yes, this seems accurate. I believe this is true and not made up. So there's lots of things you can do. You can research that information yourself. A key word I would use here is evidence. When someone writes something, they use evidence to support their assertions. So look at their examples, look at their explanation. Does it seem logical? Why or why not? And the benefit here, one of the reasons why I've let you choose almost any text you want for this assignment is ideally you'll pick something you're interested in, not something, random, and you'll be able to say, you'll be kind of an authority on yourself. If you pick your favorite movie, you know that movie well. So if you're reading an article and someone's saying something really off base about that movie, you'll know, okay, this isn't very accurate. And hopefully that'll help prepare you for later on when maybe for another class you're researching something with which you're less familiar, having practiced it on something you know better. Hopefully you'll be prepared to determine the accuracy then. And the final one is purpose. So This is, why did the author write the piece? What was their goal? And so this is more of an open-ended question. The other four are kind of all yes or no. Is it credible? Is it reliable? Is it authoritative? Is it accurate? And if the answer is yes, go ahead and use it. But thinking about purpose can help you kind of figure out the other four. Why did they write this? They may have a strong political bias, left or right, but they may still be very objective, which means unbiased in their writing. Now, let me be really clear here. Everyone has bias when they write, because when we write, we make arguments. We really can't avoid making arguments when we write. That's an inherent part of our writing. But when we use the word bias, we mean, is that author supporting their stance, their bias, their opinion with really credible, reliable, factual information? Or are they just making things up? And when you read something, you've probably read things like this. You've probably read things where you said, oh, that's just this person's opinion. This sounds like they're making it up. They're way too impassioned. They're not very objective. And then you've also probably read things where you said, oh, I don't know if I agree with this, but I see what they're saying. They present it in a way that makes sense. So a lot of these skills you already have, and you've applied them either consciously or subconsciously when you've read things. You just haven't necessarily been put in a situation where you've really had to call on them, which is what I'm doing now. So I'm hoping you'll kind of, these will become, they may already be second nature, and that you'll just apply them when you read things from now on. So a person writes something to prove their argument, but how reliable is the information they use to prove their argument? Did they approach it in an objective way and take into consideration all the research and then develop their stance, or are they just kind of spouting their opinion? So that's why you investigate the purpose. And these are the 5 things I would say to look for anytime you evaluate really anything you're reading, but especially sources for this class or other college classes. And finally, since these are all basically yes, is what you want the answer to be. If you use the source should be crap. So hopefully that's kind of funny, and hopefully that helps you remember this. You don't need to remember every word here. You don't need to remember what crap stands for, but just the idea that you read something, you're able to tell that it seems reliable when you read it, and also explain why. I don't mean you have to justify it every time. What I mean is you have a thought process where you think about, why do I find this credible? So that you're just reflecting on it a little bit more and not simply being like, yeah, this is credible. So take a few minutes, reflect on what you read, determine if it's credible or reliable or not. For this assignment, take a little more time than that. Going to ask you to fill out a worksheet on it. But ideally, that'll prepare you for the essay. You'll have all your sources picked out for the essay. All right, so now we're going to go through 3 examples, one for each of the articles I found on Black Panther. And I'll show you my research process and my analysis process and what I did to determine that all 3 of these do pass the CRAP test and are credible. And hopefully those will be good examples for you when you're doing that work yourself coming up. And so I picked this image because this is actually cookies, not poop. It just looks like the poop emoji, and it says love stinks. So it's kind of a play on the idea of how you do want the sources to be crap. You want them to pass the CRAP test so that they're credible. Good memory trick, I'm hoping. All right, here we go. So the first source we're going to look at is the scholarly one I found using the EWU. And here's the worksheet. So as you can see, it doesn't have every single aspect of the CRAP tests. They're all in here. They're not all named. But I would say the 2 most important ones, authority and evidence, are here. So I guess 3 of the most important questions. Who is the author? Can you trust them? Who is the publisher? Can you trust them? And then what evidence do you see in the text? And is that evidence reliable? I think answering those 3 questions will be helpful in evaluating any source. And then type of source, is it popular or scholarly? And then there's the actual information you would use when you're citing the source and your works cited in your paper. So that'll help you have that information ready if you fill out that part of the worksheet. All right, so for this source, it's called I remember, so if you look on this screenshot down to the purple in the bottom right, well, I should have made the text a different color. If you look to the purple in the bottom right, you'll see it's called I Remember You Was Conflicted, Reflections on Black Panther, the African American / African Divide, and Scholarly Positionings. It's by Robert LaRue. It was from Africology, the Journal of Pan-African Studies. For date, you put the date you accessed it, not the date it was published. That comes in a different part of the works cited. And so for all of them, I put the date I recorded this lecture, November 13th, 2018. Volume of issue number, it's the 11th volume, so it's the 11th year this journal has been published, and it's the 9th issue. And then the database was that Academic Search Complete, which is a ProQuest database I found or I used, through the library I showed you in the last lecture. So that's the basic information about the article you would need for the works cited. Now, if you look to the top of the page, you'll see authority. So the first question about authority is the author. I need to determine if the author is an authority on the subject or not. So here's what I did. I just looked at the article. One thing that's nice about scholarly sources is they usually provide a bio for the author, and that's in part because their sources are almost always credible. They're not shy about presenting that information. So you can see he's a professor at a college in Pennsylvania, which means he has his PhD, so a professor with a PhD. His research interests include multi-ethnic literature. So that term multi-ethnic would probably include African studies. So it would fit with our subject matter, the movie Black Panther. And then finally, he's the author of several articles and several book chapters. So he's also published other things. This is not the only thing he's published. Now, can we trust this information? I would say yes, because it's in the Journal of Pan-African Studies, which we'll see in a minute is a very credible, reliable journal. We'll be able to find biographical information like this for all of our authors. Whether or not we trust that information is going to vary from source to source. But for this one, as you'll see in a minute, I think it's reliable because this information is included in the journal with the author's bio. So they want that up front. They're not shy about presenting it. If someone is falsifying that information, it's probably a little bit harder to find. So you can see my answer here. He's a professor, PhD. He's published other things, and then his area of research is very relevant to this topic. When you fill out this worksheet, I'd like you to go more in depth with your answers. I tried to keep it simple and succinct so you'd see the important points for each example. And I also wanted to be able to fit it all on the screen easily for this lecture. When you do this, I'd expect you to write, whole sentences and a few sentences where you really give your reasons. Why is it good that a person has a PhD and has published these things? Well, it shows they're educated, and then it shows that they've done a lot of work in this field. It's not just a one-off. So those are the kinds of things I do expect you to explain in your longer answer. And there could be a lot of answers for this, which is part of why I ask for explanations. But these are the things that I think make him an authority on the subject matter of the film Black Panther and racial politics. All right, so now we'll move on to the second question there, which is about the public. So it's the Journal of Pan-African Studies. So I just typed that in and I went to their website. And as you can see, they been around a long time, since 1987. They use the term scholars, which means the people writing for them are probably like the man we just looked at. They have their PhD and their professor. That's what they usually mean by scholar. They say that their focus is the African world community. So again, the subject matter relates. It's relevant. And then it's peer-reviewed. In the very first sentence, you see peer-reviewed. So that's what makes it scholarly. That means that when this guy submitted his article and said, please publish my article, they sent it off to other people with similar degrees and had probably at least 3 people review it and waited to get yeses from all 3 of those people before saying, yes, we will publish your article. So those are all, that's what makes it scholarly. When you hear that term scholarly, that usually means it's peer-reviewed, which means it's read and approved by other experts in the field before being published. So you can see I've included all that information on here. Peer-reviewed, focused on African world community. Oh, and then perspectives of scholars from various countries. So I forgot to mention that on the last slide. But they talked about how it's not just people from Africa writing about Africa. They mentioned several times in there something like a trans-global perspective, that they have people not just from Africa, but from all countries writing about this. So that makes it a little more objective. Okay, finally, the last category we're going to look at, and most important one, is evidence. What do they use as evidence to support their argument? And again, I said I love Marvel. I love this movie, so I do feel like I'm an authority on this subject, and hopefully you feel that way about the text you've chosen. So I'm going to look in each article for places where they're talking about the film itself and see if that seems like it makes sense. So I found a quote from this first article that says, while T'Challa is, very rightly, presented as the noble protagonist and is set up as the film's titular character to be the fulfillment of those desires for affirmation, Killmonger also fulfills those desires, though from across the divide over which he and T'Challa fight. So I know T'Challa is the hero and Killmonger is the villain. I know T'Challa is a noble protagonist. I agree with that. And I know they're both kind of fighting for similar things, what they believe is best for their people. But they are divided in that T'Challa comes from Africa. He's an African prince, now king, whereas Killmonger grew up in the slums of Oakland and comes from a impoverished background in America, so he's African American. So there is this divide between them. So all of this seems pretty accurate in my understanding of the film. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, this author has credible. And you can see I put that in the paper. You don't have to necessarily put quotes in. You can if you want to. I'm doing that to show you here. And again, I'd want you to go into more detail. This is an accurate statement about the central conflict in the film. Why is that the case? I didn't want to write all that up just for the lecture. I think you kind of get the idea. So hopefully you'll do that in yours. Let's take a look at the next source. So this next source is the one I found using Google Scholar, which you can just type in Google Scholar, but Google Scholar is also on that library database. And Google Scholar provides so many results that I initially treat everything I see on there as popular. But you may very well find scholarly things on Google Scholar too. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. It's by A. David Lewis. It's called The Ancestral Lands of Black Panther and Killmonger Unburied. It's from the Journal of Religion and Film. I accessed it today for this lecture, and it's volume 22, so it's been published for 22 years, and issue number 1 from volume 22, and I found it using Google Scholar. Let's take a look at the author, A. David Lewis. So this journal doesn't have as much detail about the author. Does that mean it's less scholarly? Maybe. We should research the journal more. We will in a minute. But it says he's from the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Science. So he's at a university, a college. So that's a good first step. But I probably want a little bit more information than this to see if he's credible or not. That bio in that last journal was really extensive. I don't think this one provides enough information. I'm going to look up a little more about this author. Let's see what else I can find about him. So I did a Google search and I found he has a page on this website called About Me. And you can see his work. He does work at that Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. Education, it looks like he went to some pretty good universities. And here it says he's published other things. So there's a number of publications. This seems pretty reliable, but it looks like this is a web page he made himself. It's not His university's webpage, I actually couldn't find that. I tried. That's always a good place to look if they're a professor. Most professors have a webpage on their university. I probably just typed it into Google wrong, but maybe he's making this up. Let's see if he's making this up. So I'm going to look at the Google page. This is his My Academia page. My Academia is like Facebook, but for academics. So you can see some of his publications on here, a lot of the same information. And again, this is a page he made. So does it help me? Yes, he's published that information, put it out there in more than one spot. And it's on My Academia. People usually don't go on My Academia unless they usually are academics. There's not really a point to it. So I feel like I'm getting closer, but I'm still not 100% convinced. I'm going to look one last place. And so he published a number of books. One of his books about comic books, Graven Images, was published by Bloomsbury Academic. So Bloomsbury is a huge publisher, but they have an academic division. You can see that's highlighted there. And so if he's published by Bloomsbury Academic, that's very reliable. So is he published by them, or was he making this up? So I searched for his book on their website. Sure enough, it came up. And so they do publish his book, and they're a very reliable academic source. So I think this guy is on the up and up. I can trust him, and he seems very scholarly and academic. So I'll go ahead and fill this in. Professor, PhD, scholarly publications on these subjects that we're concerned about, Black Panther. So it's pretty similar to what I said about the last guy. The difference is that information wasn't immediately available in the journal this time. So I researched it a little bit to see, and I see, okay, it is indeed credible. Let's take a look at the journal now. Journal of Religion and Film. This was pretty quick. I just typed it in, it came up on Google, and it's published by the University of Nebraska. So, and you can see if you look in the column here, they have an editorial board. So this is pretty reliable. If it's published by University Press, it's pretty reliable. So that's all the information I really need for the published by University Press. It's going to be hard to find a university press that isn't reliable. So it ends up being a scholarly source. Even though I found it on Google Scholar, it's not really popular. It's a scholarly source. It kind of treads that line. It talks about more popular things, and it's not quite as scholarly focused as that last one we looked at, but it's published by a university press, and the authors are mostly professors. So it's still fairly scholarly. So this seems pretty reliable, but again, I want to look at that evidence to make sure. So again, I found a quote. We'll see if it passes my smell test for my knowledge of Black Panther. A number of early reviews of Black Panther have centered on the moral conflict at the center of the film. T'Challa, played admirably by Chadwick Boseman, may be the title character of the movie, but when does he actually become its hero? Good question. So this seems very credible to me. Again, I've seen this movie and I love it. That is a central question. He kind of has to become the Black Panther through the course of the film, step into that role. So he's technically already the Black Panther when it begins, but he really comes to understand what that means and embrace it through the course of the film. So I think this guy really gets that movie. And he also cites other reviews here. If you look at his references page, you'll see these reviews he's mentioned, he cited. So he's done the research on the film, kind of synthesized it, and is saying the synthesis of that research focuses on this question that's central to understanding the film. This guy has done his reading and he understands the film. This is a credible source. I definitely feel okay about using it in my paper. All right, last one. So this is the web article, which is most definitely a popular source. There are web articles out there that are scholarly, but the one I found was popular, and it has the images and whatnot like your essay will because it's a web article. So this will be a little bit harder to evaluate. We've progressed from how obviously scholarly a source was to here where it's not technically scholarly at all. So in that case, how do we determine if it's credible? If it's not by a professor, if it's not published by a university press, how do we decide if we should use it or not? That's what we're going to figure out with this last source. So in some respects, this is the most important example for those. All right, so the author is Trey Johnson. It's called Black Panther is a Gorgeous, Groundbreaking Celebration of Black Culture. It's published by Vox. I accessed it today, and since it's not from a database or anything, it doesn't have a volume and issue number because Vox publishes dozens of articles a day, so it is just the URL is what you then use, and you're works cited. Now let's evaluate it. Here's the author, Trey Johnson. Vox didn't have any information about him on their website, so that information is not up front like it was in the two scholarly journals. So I just Googled him. Several Trey Johnsons came up, but when I saw this one wrote about race, class, and culture, this must be the guy, I figured. So I went to his webpage. So he has an About Me. Now, he seems pretty reliable. He says he's published things in Rolling Stone, Vox, and Atlanta Black Star. And Vox is this journal that this comes from, but Rolling Stone is certainly not a scholarly journal, but it's a well-respected magazine that's been around a long time, that fact-checks its sources and has established a solid reputation. It's probably one of the most influential popular culture journals of all time. So that's fairly reliable, especially for an assignment like this. You might not want to cite it in a more scholarly type of assignment, but because you're doing an analysis of pop culture, Rolling Stone is a fairly reliable source. And Atlanta Black Star is a pretty good source too. So he claims he's published in these places. We should probably check that. He also says he's worked in education in the classroom, nonprofits and school districts as a teacher. So seems very reliable, but again, he made this website. This is his own website, and he probably is using it to help himself get published. So can we trust this or not? I want to, but I think I need to look a little bit more to make sure. So I clicked on the page of his website that says publications. And here you can see all the things he's published. And sure, he lists, you see Rolling Stone, a few down there. You can see Atlanta Black Star. So, actually the one at the very top is also Rolling Stone. So he's claiming it in several spots, and that's pretty bold if you were making this all up. So I'm starting to trust it more, but I still want to double check. So I'm going to look for Black Superheroes Matter, why a Black Panther movie is revolutionary. Did Rolling Stone really publish that? I'm going to check. And sure enough, they did. It looks very similar to his Vox article. But again, for work we're doing, Rolling Stone's probably reliable enough. I'm not saying, solely because the authors in Rolling Stone means you can use them. But if you're using popular sources, that's a good kind of box to check. We still need to look at the evidence, but that seems pretty reliable. Okay, so here's our author information. He's published numerous articles on this topic. You can see all of his articles are about Black culture and pop culture, and places as well known as Rolling Stone. So I think the author passes the smell test. What about Vox? Again, I went to their website. I had to look around for a long time. I had to scroll to the bottom of the page to find the About Us button. So again, the information isn't right up front, but here's what they claim. Vox explains the news. We live in a world of too much information and too little context, too much noise and too little insight. And so Vox's journalists candidly shepherd audiences through politics and policy, business and pop culture, food science, and everything else that matters. So you can see they have a very noble mission statement. This mission statement makes me want to trust them and want to think they're reliable. Because they say candidly shepherds audience. So that word candid means they're being very frank. They're being very objective. They're being very upfront and honest. That's what they're claiming here by using that word candid. And I like their mission. This is exactly the problem I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. So this is a good way to kind of come full circle. That we're confronted with all this information. How do we believe it? Now, Vox is saying their goal is to help guide you through that information. It's almost similar to my goal in this lecture. to guide you through that information so that you know what to believe or not. So this is very noble. This seems pretty reliable. How do I know for sure? How do I know they're not just making this up? Well, on the one hand, their purpose is geared around candidacy, being candid, and helping people. So why would you make that up? If you're going to lie about something, it would probably be a different type of purpose. But I still want to research it more. So you can see who the three founders are there. So I'm going to research each of them. The main founder, Ezra Klein, worked for the Washington Post, which is pretty reliable, and he is a journalist. So he's got a lot of experience in this. Melissa Bell worked with him at the Washington Post. She also launched a newspaper in India called Mint, so she's done this kind of work before. Okay, that's pretty solid. The last guy is also worked as a journalist, and he wrote for The Atlantic, which is a very reliable journal. I've talked about The Atlantic before. So all three of these people who founded it seem very reliable. They have a really well-intentioned mission statement. But how do I trust that mission statement? I just want to research it a little bit more. So I looked up Vox on Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia is not necessarily reliable either because anyone can edit it, but people don't often make stuff up on Wikipedia. I have found things on Wikipedia that are incorrect, but they usually have to do with something major, like a big new announcement about something. People probably aren't going on here and making stuff up about Vox. I don't know that for sure, but Wikipedia is just a very easy place to find information quickly. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a little Wikipedia research on Vox itself. The first thing I see is Vox is a left-wing American news and opinion website. That to me is alarming. That's disconcerting because that shows a clear political bias. Even if, hypothetically, I were left-wing, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good source to use in my paper because I don't want my essay I'm writing, to seem biased either. So that's problematic. But I really like their mission statement. Let me read a little bit more. So down here on content, the part I've highlighted, Vox's mission is to, quote, explain the news, meaning it strives to make sure its readers understand what just happened by providing contextual information that traditional news stories aren't designed to carry. So Vox creates these card stacks, or bright canary yellow. These things are bright yellow, so you see them easily, that provide context and define terms within an article. The cards are perpetually maintained as a form of wiki page written by one person with a little attitude. So basically what they're saying is in order to kind of fulfill the mission statement, Vox has these little yellow cards on every single one of their web articles. And those cards have the contextual information. They define terms that might help understand the article. So I really like that. I don't like their left-wing bias, but I like that they're working hard and incorporating things in their webpage to fulfill their mission statement about giving context to help understand the news. So I'm going to say, depending on the evidence, it seems okay to use this Vox article in my essay. So that's what I put. They do have a left-wing bias, but they work hard to give context for their news stories. That seems like a very reliable mission, that the information is going to have some political bias, but for the most part, it'll be fairly reliable. So finally, though, to really say yes, I'll use this in the paper, I'm going to look at the evidence. So again, I found a quote, Black Panther is in many ways a love letter to Black culture. Africa has traditionally been an unsophisticated player in American media, often portrayed as backward, savage, and chaotic, in everything from news coverage to films. So what they're saying is that traditionally, not in every case, but a lot of times in film, Africa, the continent, in African culture has been portrayed negatively with these bad stereotypes of backward, savage, and chaotic. And that's true if you think about it. If you've seen other movies depicting African culture, this is a fairly accurate, from the films I've seen, this seems like an accurate statement. And then it says it's a portrayal that has left little room for other interpretations, which is why Black Panther's vision of Wakanda as a bustling metropolis of vibranium-powered, futuristic skyscrapers, racing trains, and soaring spaceships feels so refreshing. And I know that's true, that those things are all in the movie because I've seen the movie, and I can see how it would seem refreshing when I put the two comments together. What I've seen about other movies that depict African culture is true. This description of Black Panther is accurate, and I can see, oh yeah, that is very different. That's not cliched and stereotyped. So that seems very reliable. I'm going to say it passes the smell test in terms of this. So that's what I put here. First, I might not be sure about his argument about African culture. But then once I read kind of he's using evidence. He's using other films about African culture, and then he's connecting that evidence, synthesizing with Black Panther to say Black Panther offers something that's not as cliche and stereotypical as what's come before. So I think when I think about those two things in conjunction, his thesis makes sense, and so I believe him. I could be wrong, but this seems pretty factual and pretty reliable. I would say it passes the crap test. And even though it's in a biased journal, the information presented seems fairly objective. So I'm going to say, yes, I would use this in my paper. So hopefully this lecture has been helpful. Again, I'd like you to go through these steps for 3 of your own sources, determine if they're credible or not. If they are credible, then definitely use them in your paper. If they're not credible, then maybe find a different one. But apply this test to everything you read in general. Everything for this class, every source you use in the paper should pass this test. But beyond that, in life, as you're reading social media posts a day, if you're like me and you were just reading articles about football on your phone before you did this lecture, check the smell test. Is it believable or not? Is it crap? Is it credible and reliable and authoritative and accurate? Does it have an objective purpose? So hopefully you've got some fundamental skills here that'll help you with the paper, but also as you encounter information in our culture.